Hello, everybody. It's an absolute pleasure and a joy to be with you this afternoon. Like many of you, my psychedelic lineage goes back to Stan Grof. And to go back with Stan Grof, it goes back to Prague, where Stan did his early work. Stan's work changed the course of my life, and therefore Prague changed the course of my life. The work that was begun here deeply affected me and deeply affected many of my students who worked with me 4,000 miles away. So what I would like to do today is to come back to Prague and to bring you a report of where the work that was begun here touched my life and where it took me. Now, this is only the second time that I've tried to talk about this, so please forgive me if I'm a little choppy and I'm maybe following my notes a little more closely than I might otherwise do. When I first read Realms of the Human Unconscious in 1978, I immediately recognized that Stan's work was a revolution not only in psychology, but it was a revolution in philosophy, that very quickly philosophers doing the deepest work would be writing out of an experiential basis, not out of an intellectual basis. And so I made the decision to begin a psychedelic journey, to begin quiet, behind the scenes, a rigorous psychedelic inquiry, which eventually became a 20-year journey. I worked for 4 years, and then I stopped my work for 6 years for reasons I discuss in the book and won't go into now. And then I resumed the work for another 10 years. I did 73 sessions, high-dose sessions, working at 500 and 600 micrograms, which is a protocol that I don't necessarily recommend. And I want to emphasize that I did this work as a philosopher, not a clinician. I wasn't primarily seeking healing. I was seeking an understanding of our universe. I wanted to immerse myself as deeply into my consciousness and through that immersion into the mind of the universe as possible. I wanted to learn how this world works. I saw myself as basically doing an extension of William James's radical empiricism, which involved 3 steps: systematically pushing the boundaries of experience, and then making a precise phenomenological record of one's experiences, and then critically analyzing those experiences, bringing them into dialogue with other fields of knowledge, with other fields of learning, and seeking social validation where possible. So let me first a few points on methodology, a few concepts, and then we'll kind of go into the story of where the journey went. We are all familiar with the distinction between low-dose psycholytic therapy and high-dose psychedelic therapy. When I did this work, I saw myself as basically doing an extended regimen of psychedelic therapy. Though the original protocols at Spring Grove Hospital limited those sessions to 1 to 3 sessions, and the idea was to try to trigger a one-time immersion into deep transcendence, I thought, well, what could be done safely 1 to 3 times could be done safely more times. Over time, I realized, yes, it could be done safely, but opening a long, extended course of high-dose psychedelic therapy opened up challenges, complications, and opportunities that weren't present in psychedelic therapy as it was originally conceived. And so eventually, I did not appreciate it at the beginning and while I was doing this work, but when I got to the end and was looking back, I began to appreciate the radical nature of the undertaking, and I felt I had to give this a different name, and so I'm calling it psychedelic exploration. The method is that of psychedelic therapy. Complete isolation, sitter, eye shades, headphones, all the everything that Stan articulates so clearly in LSD psychotherapy. But the difference is repeated immersion into that state multiple times, for me, 73 times. Now, I wouldn't recommend this protocol. Knowing what I know today, if I were doing it over again, I would take a different approach. I would be gentler on myself. I would be more comfortable with the slower immersion into the great expanse. I would balance high-dose psychedelic sessions with low-dose sessions, and also, since LSD tends to push the high cosmological ceiling, it tends to be a high-altitude psychedelic, I would balance that with psychedelics that are more body-grounded, psilocybin, ayahuasca. I think the balance of those different methodologies produce a better result. But that's what I understand now after I did this work. At the time, there were no elders telling me how to proceed, so I had to kind of figure these things out as I went. I tried to be as rigorous as I possibly could, being the philosopher trained that I was in linguistic analysis. My background is philosophy of religion. I kept very close records. I have notes that number 400 pages. I kept track of all the astrological variables. When, from my conversations with Rick Tarnas, I began to understand the correlations between the outer planets and deep experiences. I used astrology to time my sessions, and I have always projected my sessions against the astrological maps of personal and some global transits in order to sort of pay attention to this map to see how it unfolded in the work. And when I've come to tell the story of this work, I'm really not telling a personal story. I mean, it's a personal story, but the personal story is the least important part of the story. This map, this diagram kind of represents a string of sessions, and I found that after about the first 15 sessions, my personal life, the things that were relevant to my personal life, insights, helps, really came in the beginning of the session and at the end of the session, when I was leaving and when I was coming back into time-space reality. For the most part, not always, but for the most part, when I was in the peak experiences, I was operating in a level of reality that was far beyond personal reality. And that's the story, I think, which is the most philosophically relevant. That's the story of the adventure into the universe, and that's the story I'm trying to tell in Diamonds from Heaven. When one does this type of work, one goes into, as I said, a spiral of initiation. One goes deeper and deeper. I have this going up. Now let's flip it and go down. This is not a story, kind of an ascent. It doesn't plug into the cosmologies of ascent. It's much more kind of a cosmology of depth. But I didn't have time to make the inversions of the pictures. The drop at the bottom of the image is ego. I really should be open. There is no line, solid line there, but I couldn't draw that. I'm not very gifted in that way. So the drop is, everything below that crossed line is time-space reality. Everything above that line opens up in beyond time and space reality. And when one does this work, one goes through not just one, but a series of punctuated death-rebirth cycles. And I've included the glyphs of the outer planets on these cycles in honor of Stan and Rick's insights into the rhythm of the rhythms of death and rebirth are often paced and flow with the rhythms of the solar system, and as one experiences oneself as a child of the solar system in this work as in life in general. Now, there are several ways in which you can tell the story of this descent or in this opening into the larger universe. I use the categories that Stan uses in his work, psychic, subtle, causal. I don't have any vested interest in any specific set of categories for this multiple layers and layers and layers of the universe, nor do I have any vested interest in how many cycles of death and rebirth there are. This is simply representative of a principle that the deeper you go, there are periods when you come to a gate. And when you come to a gate, you must surrender everything that you have known and been up to that point in time, which in the later circles is everything you have known and been in all of your psychedelic experience up to that point in time. Everything you have known from 10 or 15 years of experience, you must let go. You must surrender it if you're going to be born into an even deeper dimension of psychedelic reality. Now, this is oversimplifying the schematic, of course. It's much more complicated. Here I'm suggesting these numbers in these circles are numbers of sessions, And here is repeated deepening, enter deepening, deeper and deeper into causal reality, which you can picture in terms of one giant circle, but really there were multiple punctuated, rhythmic death and rebirth cycles in an ever-deepening progression into causal reality. In this journey, you are in dialogue with an infinite consciousness, and this intelligence speaks to you from different depths on different days. Wisdom coming from different levels of reality carries different inflections, reflecting different starting points, different sets of assumptions. It takes time to map the structure of these sequences to recognize the logic of the larger whole. I spent years while I was doing this work trying to understand it. I spent years after I had finished this work in 99. This all took place between 79 and 99. It takes time to map the complete logical structure of all these complex interweaving experiences. So the story I'm telling, this is how I imagined the book. It's just my own imagination. It's not in a publisher's yet, so who knows what's going to happen when it's at a publisher's. But in my mind's eye, this is Diamonds from Heaven. And the easiest way to tell you take you onto this journey, to give you just a thumbnail of a few sketches, is to take you through the chapters and a few comments maybe on each chapter. So here are the chapters from Diamonds from Heaven. Crossing the perinatal plane, the ocean of suffering, deep time in the soul, initiation into the universe, the greater real of archetypal reality, benediction of blessings, the birth of the future human, diamond luminosity, and final visions. Now, the chapters that are missing is there's an introductory chapter, and there's a chapter where I give a sort of a typical session day, but in terms of the content of the sessions, these are the chapters that cover it. So, let's hope I can keep this in the time allowed. You know, I'm just writing this book, I'm finishing the last chapter, so it's all in my head. Keeping it all proportionate and scaled down to size, kind of tricky, so. Crossing the perinatal plane is the easiest to summarize because we all know it so well. Intense confrontation with death, intense fetal sensations, severe perinatal seizures, purging the body, eventually ending in ego death. And this took 2.5 years and 10 sessions. In the end, the 9th and 10th session just took me and snapped me like a twig, turned me inside out. I started the day as a white male, Ivy League educated philosopher, obsessed with the meaning of life. In the sessions, it turned me into women of color, women who were poor, women who had no philosophical interest whatsoever. It was the perfect hell for a male philosopher. Scared me to death. When eventually I yielded and I allowed myself to become fully a woman, I died and was reborn into the world of women, into the lives of hundreds of women, and I was taken on a wonderful journey through their lives under the arm of the Great Mother. I wish every man could have that opportunity that I had to experience the feminine side of life so deeply. And it wasn't the feminine side of my former lives. It was larger than that. The message was not reclaim your lives that you've had as a woman. I believe I have. I know I have. The message was, where you are going, gender does not exist. Let go. After that, for the next 2 years, I entered what I came to call the ocean of suffering. I entered, sessions have two halves. There's the cleansing half and the ecstatic half. In the cleansing half, I entered the ocean of suffering. I entered step by step, deeper and deeper, systematically entering deeper and deeper dimensions of excruciating pain, excruciating suffering, an ocean of suffering, an ocean of rage, which eventually extended to include what appeared to be the entire history of the human race. The endurance, there was a tremendous practice that was required to endure literally the depth and breadth of the kind of suffering that emerged. At first, I thought this was a deepening of ego death. I understood this as a kind of a deepening, some collective dimension was a deepening of ego death. But it went on for so long, and it involved so many beings that eventually I changed my mind on that, and I came to the conclusion that this cleansing was not really aimed at my personal transformation at all. That somehow my sessions had gone through some transformation, and the universe was using my sessions to heal or to cleanse some dimension of the human psyche itself. We were carrying the scars, we carried the scars of human history in our collective unconscious, and somehow my sessions had become a vehicle for working to heal those scars. Now, I went into this for a year, and then I stopped my sessions for 6 years. In the first year, when I was going into the ocean of suffering, when I went into the ecstatic portion of the session, I entered what I came to call a deep time in the soul. I went outside of linear time, and I entered deep time, and I had the experience repeatedly over 7 sessions of experiencing my life as a completed whole, start to finish. And all the details of my life were present as a completed whole. The first time I went into this state, it was so radical. When I came out of it, it was the most moving experience of my life, but I couldn't even remember it. I could just catch details. I couldn't hold it. But when I went into it a second time and a third time and a fourth time, I was able to hold on to more and more of it. The fragments became more complete gestalts. And this is an important epistemological point. If you're working with non-ordinary states in a way to work with them in philosophy or any critical context, you have to train yourself in order to maintain coherent cognitions in these radical states of consciousness. If you have glancing contact and you just kind of touch it here and there, well, that's okay. But if you want to have sustained and accurate experiences in these deep visionary states, you have to learn how to stabilize consciousness in these states. And what may be fragmentary in the early stages, if you go back with focus and intention, they will become more coherent. You'll be able to learn how to stay awake in levels of consciousness that in the beginning just sort of swallow you. After the 6-year break, when I started again at a different time in my life, at a different age, different set of expectations, and under different astrological skies, the ocean of suffering started exactly where it had stopped 6 years before, which is a measure, I think, an indication of the intelligence and the intentionality of the universe that you are engaging in these states. But during the ecstatic portion of these sessions, we started at a completely different spot. Completely with no explanation for the transition, I was given a series of visions of the universe, of how the universe works. I was taken deep into creation, and I was given a systematic course of instruction. It was like the intelligence of the universe was teaching me in a very systematic and rigorous manner. Now, I give my sessions names. I give each session a name that identifies the pith of the session. And I also not only write up the sessions, but I break them down in bullet points. I try to hold my entire journey in my mind at the same time. And by giving my sessions a name, when I see the name, it reminds me of what the content of the session is. So these are the sessions that I address in this year year period. This is 1 year. After the 6-year break, these are the sessions that I was addressing. Session 18 and 19 are present in Dark Night, Early Dawn. You may have seen them there. Dying into Oneness is also there. The master plan is the beginning of a multiple series of visions that I'll come back to later, where I was given visions of where the intelligence of the universe is taking the human race, where we are, what kind of cosmological journey we're on. Eventually, the ocean of suffering culminated in an orgy of pain in healing the collective wound. Just hard to imagine, hard to describe the nature of the pain. And it came to a crescendo, and at that point, it spun me into archetypal reality for 18 months. The next 18 months of work. and the ocean of suffering never reappeared. It never came back again. Which left me with an intellectual puzzle. Why does an individual stop in working at that particular collective level when clearly there's collective pain left in the collective psyche? Why does it stop for an individual when it continuing for the species as a whole? And I address that at the end pages of Dark Night, Early Dawn, and I also address it in Diamonds from Heaven. When I entered archetypal reality, I consistently, over 11 sessions and a year and a half, I had the experience of entering into the reality that was more real than physical reality, which is very disorienting, but it was like coming out of Plato's cave. I had entered the greater real, the real which is constitutive of physical reality. When I first entered archetypal reality, my identity as a human being began to fall away from me. I found that we have a human identity that is deeper than our individual human identity. And when my humanity began to fall away, it actually was a deeper kind of death than ego death. It was to basically cease to be a human being at the most fundamental form. And I was moved into a level of consciousness that I experienced as being above human experience. It was like a space station orbiting above Earth, where you get this radical, expanded overview. The energy, the transformative fire that was involved in making this transition, death takes different forms as you move into different levels, and the form that it took for me at this particular level involved liquid fire, white-hot lava flows, exploding sun flares, liquid fire pouring through me, completely transporting me and transforming my experience. These are the chapters that I address in this particular chapter. You see how much cleansing is involved even after moving into this territory. The 28th session was an extraordinarily positive, powerful session, partly which again is echoed in Dark Night, Early Dawn. It was my first contact with causal reality, an extremely beautiful, pure state of consciousness. But the next 3 sessions were terrible ordeals of cleansing, just deep, visceral detoxification. And I began to understand every level deeper or into the universe is a higher level of energy. And when you begin to get access to these higher or deeper levels of energy, you have to acclimate to this higher energy. And you have to go through a detoxification process to be able to stabilize consciousness at this higher level of energy. So just this one contact, with maybe lasted 30 minutes, with causal level reality, just took days and days, over a 6-month period, 3 sessions of detoxification, so that I could return to that level in a more coherent, more cognitively coherent form. My experiences of archetypal reality basically kind of took place at 2 levels, at the high subtle level and the low subtle level. At the high subtle level, I experienced archetypes, but not archetypes like Platonic archetypes, not unchanging ideas in the mind of an unchanging God, but living beings, contact with vast living beings, millions of light years across. My mind sort of imaged them as galaxies. It was the best that it could do to approximate them. I could catch only glimpses of their way of being in the world, their mode of being. They were just vast, enormous, ancient. There was nothing, my mind could not wrap itself around these, and yet these were the beings that were the creators of time and space. These were the beings which were living through humanity, which in some fundamental way were expressing themselves through the life of all living beings on our planet and elsewhere in the universe. At the low, subtle level, I entered sort of more of a Jungian level of the psyche. I repeatedly was immersed in experiences of our species as a single organism, and I experienced the network intelligence of this single organism, the intelligence of our collective psyche, and the intelligence even of our collective body. I began to have experiences of reincarnation as a species experiences it, not as an individual. I had always thought of reincarnation kind of in an individual soul story, but now I was having experiences of our entire planet, the pulse of reincarnation of our entire planet, billions and billions of people, every generation pulsing, and that the evolution was not just an evolution of an aggregate of individuals, but that there was an evolution of an entire species. This is how the species was evolving itself. And there was an intelligence and a coordination of all of our individual karma into this larger pattern of species karma. It was on one hand a numinous experience and a devastating experience all at the same time. To experience all of our individual lives completely subsumed and drawn into these collective patterns just opened up a whole new level of appreciation of the intelligence of the universe. After 18 months of working at the archetypal level, I came into a year of extraordinary blessings, what I call the benediction of blessings. I entered causal level reality repeatedly and stably. These are the 4 sessions that I address and reproduce complete in the book. The forest was an experience of profound, non-dual, shunyata, emptiness, oneness of all existence, completely dissolved, myself dissolved, every self dissolved completely in the universe. And many of you know these things. You know what I'm talking about. Singing the universe away was basically culminated in being taken into the formless void, the fertile void, the primal essence that underlies all manifest existence. Jesus' blood was being drenched in cosmic love beyond any proportions I'd ever known previously. But I'll just mention the birth of the diamond soul, because this is going to come up later in the work. Previously, 11 years before, I had experienced my life as a completed whole, but now I began to experience the integration of all my former lives coming in fast and furious. It was like winding string on a kite spool. Just bringing in all these lives kept coming in and becoming more and more compact, and suddenly they seemed to hit a critical mass and they fused. And when they fused, there was an explosion of light. It was my first real contact with what I would call the diamond light. An explosion of light broke out of my chest. And I think what I was being guided into was where reincarnation is taking humanity. Reincarnation is not simply growing us year by year, chapter by chapter, century by century, where we're accumulating talents, more compassion, more understanding. It's not just taking us on a slow linear journey. I've become convinced that eventually, as we accumulate more and more and more of this precious commodity that is human experience, eventually we come to a point where there is an igniting, a fusion that takes place, and we explode into something more than simply the sum of what we have been. It catapults us into a higher order of intelligence, a much more profound transparency to the divine, to the communion with the universe, and a much deeper sense of communion with each other, because we have been family, enemies, friends, partners, collaborators with so many beings through history. When we fuse and our entire history becomes one, there is a sense in which we awaken to that deep history, and it naturally expands our heart into an open-ended, unqualified compassion, not only for human beings, but for all being. What happened next is really where I went from the birth of the benediction of blessings, I went into the diamond luminosity work. But before I go into that, I have to backtrack a little bit and talk about the birth of the future human. When I began this work in 1979, I never imagined that the future of humanity was going to become part of the work. I was still thinking within an individual model. I was doing this for my individual healing, my individual enlightenment, whatever. But now I think this chapter is probably the most important chapter of the book, because it concerns my children and your children and our children of our children and the children of their children. It describes an evolutionary process that I believe humanity is coming to, and the powerful forces that are taking us through a transformative process that's going to change the fundamental foundation of life on this planet, not only socially and politically and economically and industrially, but psychologically. Something that will result literally in the birth of a new species. Stan referenced this a couple of days ago in his comments. The birth of the future human. In this chapter, what I do is summarize and bring together all the visions that I had been given through 3 years, into a first series called The Visions of Awakening, 6 visions that I put together. And the extraordinary thing for me was beginning to understand, to be taken into, that the universe is trying to awaken on the entire species. Everything in my life, everything in your life, everything in all of our lives, everything we're struggling with in history, everything seemed to be part of this fundamental endeavor. It was as if the universe only cared about the awakening of the species. This was the work of the hour. This is what we are all involved in. And I think this is what we all knew we were getting involved in before we chose to incarnate at this crazy time in history. We knew what we were getting into. We chose to be here precisely to be part of this grand adventure, to put our shoulder to the wheel and help humanity through this process. The core vision of the future that has come through my sessions repeatedly, over and over again, is that humanity is coming to a time of great awakening. But for there to be a great awakening, there must first take place a great death. We must be emptied of the old before the new can emerge, and I think the 21st century is the beginning of that process. It will begin the dark night of our collective soul, a time of intense anguish, of emptying, of loss of control, of breakdown, a collective purification under death that will last generations. But through this hard labor, we will give birth to something extraordinary. More than a new civilization, what is emerging is nothing less than a new order of human being. Through the global systems crisis, I think we are giving birth to the future human. And I think the future human will take the form, the way I image it will be the diamond soul. I think as we are struggling to become one planet on the outer world, in all that that involves, that is paralleled by a process that's taking place intrapsychically as we are struggling to become one soul, one integrated being. And there is a synergistic, collaboration between the outer process and the inner process, so that as this comes to fruition, we will emerge on a new collective psychological process. The benediction of blessings felt like the closing of a great circle. I had been asked to give something in the ocean of suffering, and I gave it. And in response, the universe poured more blessings into me than I could possibly hold. I felt completely and utterly satisfied. I had been touched in oneness and known love and taken into the fertile void, and as a philosopher, it was like the greatest adventure I had ever imagined. I was completely satisfied. I had no idea where things would go next, but there was still 5 years ahead on the journey. What happened was, after going through one more very intense death and rebirth, death process, I was spun into a brilliantly clear, superluminescent light that Buddhism calls the absolute clear light of Dharmakaya. I call it the domain of diamond luminosity. Now, I had known light many times before, the blessings of light many times in many different forms, and this was different. When I talk about diamond luminosity, I'm not simply trying to use a colorful metaphor to describe the light. I'm trying to describe a particular quality of light, an exceptionally pure light, a light that became so pure and so refined it became ultimately invisible and clear, hyper clear, a clarity that just, the Buddhists are right, touch it once undoes generations of living in the shadows of karma. Over the next 4 years, in 25 sessions, the gateway to this domain opened 4 times, and just 4 times. These were the 4 sessions. In between these 4 sessions, as you probably guessed, more detoxification, more purification, more gut, and more personal healing. But interesting that personal healing came into the story so late rather than so early. I would have thought personal healing would have come early, but it came late, but we don't have time to go into why. There were 2 movements in the diamond luminosity, essentially. The first 2 of these sessions took me deeper and deeper into this condition. And then when I was deeply immersed in the diamond luminosity, something happened that changed my whole vision of reality. I was in a good place. And all of a sudden, in the far distance, everything pivoted 90 degrees, and I saw reality far, far in the distance. And I was hit by a bolt of lightning, a bolt of light, and it absolutely shattered me. I called it the absolute light, just to give it a name. But it was a reality. I saw that this reality was as far beyond where I was in the diamond luminosity as the diamond luminosity was from Youngstown, Ohio. And at that point, I realized it's an endless journey. It's an infinite universe, and there is no such thing as coming to the end of the journey. See, like many of us, I had assimilated from multiple sources the idea that there is an end point to this journey. I always was kind of waiting to get to the end point. Some people speak of it as oneness with God, and some people speak of it as the fertile void. But I had experienced oneness with God, and I had discovered that there are actually permutations, there are layers of oneness and deeper dimensions of oneness. And I had experienced the void, and though it sounds like a contradiction, I had discovered that there are actually depths of void, depths of formlessness. When I had reached the diamond luminosity, I thought, I finally have reached it. There was such a sense of homecoming, such a sense of fulfillment. I thought I finally had reached my destination. And I did. This is where my destination stopped. But this taught me that there were worlds upon worlds beyond even this. It's an infinite progression. And that's why I would be gentler on myself if I were doing it again. It isn't like the goal is to get to some dimension, some condition. I think the goal is to become increasingly transparent and to let in as much of the spiritual world as possible and to absorb it into our physical being and to become embodied divinity right here, right now. Those dimensions exist, they're magnificent. We came from them, we go to them. But I think the goal of deep work is bring it here right now. The final visions, the last year's work. The last 2 sessions were what I call the goodbye sessions. I did not know we were ending. I thought I was going to continue. Even though I was having some problems along the way, I thought we were going to continue. But the universe knew that we were ending and orchestrated the ending and gave me a series of experiences in the last 2 sessions that were very personal, gave me a retrospective analysis of all of my work and all of the years, put everything in perspective, and in the last session gave me a series of last-minute instructions as I was about to go. But before that, there was one more serious piece of work to do, Session 70. Session 70 put me through the hardest, worst strip down that I went through anywhere on the entire journey. If you think all the hard work is done in the beginning and then it's going to get easier, well, it does in some ways, but if you push the edge, well, let's just say 70 just really stripped me down hard. And the reason it stripped me down so hard, I think, was to move me into the very deep state of transtemporal consciousness that it moved me into. It moved me deeper into deep time than it had ever moved me before. And time opened up into a time scale of something on the order of 100,000 years. And I experienced human evolution and humanity in terms of, I experienced whole life forms dying and being reborn every few seconds. Time became enormously accelerated. And in that process, I was given one last set of teachings about human evolution, about the future human. And it felt like really important that I get this. The universe wanted me to make sure I understood this. It was a missing piece. And the missing piece was that we are built for speed. Humanity is built for accelerated evolution. And we have a tendency to think very statically in terms of human nature this and human nature that. But when you expand your time horizon to 100,000 years, even your imagination, and you look, and we have these wonderful films where we take us through, Homo, the early Homo, the early evolutionary history, but we are built for speed. And it's something about the very short-lived nature of our incarnate lives, 100 years at a time, 100 years, quick. Underneath that, the fundamental archetype of the human psyche grows and is learning, we're learning and learning. And when that archetype shifts, then there is an exponential change in our evolutionary dynamic. They're going to be coming for me soon, so I have to hurry up. My books have all come out of this. Life Cycles came out of Deep Time in the Soul, that work. The Living Dark Night, Early Dawn came out of Initiation into the Universe. It came out of the Ocean of Suffering, trying to explain why that became so large. There's some dimensions there of a greater real of archetypal reality. My book, The Living Classroom, which I'm so happy now has been translated into Czech. Thank you, Peter Lisi. Is about something that happened. It's about how my sessions, which were private, I never talked to my students about my sessions. They were, you can't brandish this work in Ohio. Never talked to them about my sessions, but I found over time my students were being activated by my work. The work that I was doing was beginning to impact their lives, and I had to think about this. I had to understand it. I had to learn how to work with this. And there's a chapter on this in Dark Night, Early Dawn, and eventually I broke it out into a small book, which doesn't mention psychedelics at all, because it's not about psychedelics. It's about the nature of consciousness. It's about that our consciousness has no boundaries. Our mind is, in some sense, a center of an infinite lake, and it has no boundaries, so that when we do deep work, it naturally reaches out and touches those around us. And integration requires attending to the ramifications, the social ramifications of our work. It's not just personal, it's also a social integration. Which brings me now to the last chapter, Coming Off the Mountain. Where am I? Okay. Excuse me for 1 minute while I find where my notes are. Yeah, here we go. Okay. I stopped my work for two reasons. I stopped this work, pain and heartache. Pain because my subtle energy system, my prana, my chi, even though I had taken all the precautions possible and I had done all the yoga and meditation and really taken care of my body, my subtle energy system was running so hot that I was always uncomfortable, and I was having to deal with complications that really having to do from an overexcited subtle energy system. When you open yourself to states of consciousness this deep, there are huge waves of energy that move through you. And but that wasn't the main reason. The main reason was the heartache. I could no longer bear the heartache of coming back from the diamond luminosity. It became too painful for me to come back from being dissolved into the divine. After I stopped my sessions in my meditation, one of my meditations shortly thereafter, a voice said to me, Spirit said, 20 years in, 20 years out. Meaning it'll take you 20 years to integrate where you went in those 20 years. And I thought, that sounds about right. Now, however, I'm drawing close to those 20 years. I'm almost coming up 2 years out of 20 years. And I'm thinking, that was an optimistic projection. It took 5 years for my subtle energy system to calm down and to find its new equilibrium. And years after I stopped my session, I found myself entering into a deep existential sadness. I was suffering from the loss of communion with the divine. I knew when I stopped, I knew that I was not going to go this deep into the universe again until I died. But I had to stop. But the emotional and psychological cost of not being able to enter into communion that intimately with the divine was hard. Once you have known the joy of becoming light, once you have known the ecstasy of the boundless ecstasy of being dissolved into the crystalline body of God, life on earth can feel kind of dried up. People who have had near-death episodes have had this experience. Carl Jung had this experience when he had his near-death episode in the hospital. Now, I knew that I was every moment immersed in the body of my beloved, which is the word that I use for the absolute being. I knew that she was and is the root and the flower of my existence. But this knowledge did not save me entirely from the pain of being separated from the full intensity of her presence. And this is where the cruelty of the temporary nature of psychedelic work cut deepest for me. If I had touched the divine only once or twice, perhaps it would have been different. Perhaps then the memory of the divine would have just carried me along and everything would have been okay. But my beloved, had taken me into her so deeply, so many times, that life on earth just began to lose its appeal. Eventually, I began to realize that I was just waiting to die. I was doing my work, I was taking care of my family, I was doing my lectures, but in my heart of hearts, I was waiting to die so that I could return to the divine light. And time went on, I began to realize, this isn't right. This is not the way it's supposed to be. In my meditations, the universe said to me, self-inflicted wounds. That's all, self-inflicted wounds, dummy. I began to realize that somewhere along the way, I had made a mistake. Somewhere along the way, I had lost a critical balance between transcendence and immanence, between the going beyond physical reality and living within physical reality. I had pushed myself so deeply into the divine expanse that I was suffering from too much God. Or maybe that's not a fair way to put it. I was suffering from too much transcendence. I also, at this period, had to confront an over-attachment and addiction to marijuana that I developed during this time. Because marijuana basically kept me from coming fully off the mountain. It allowed me to sort of stay light and float a little bit above the earth. And I had to come completely off the mountain, so I had to let go of that. And I had to come completely off the mountain and be fully grounded inside physical reality if the divine that I had experienced in my sessions was ever going to fully awaken inside my historical existence. It took me 10 years after I stopped my sessions to become fully grounded inside time and space. Integration is not just psychological. Integration is social. What do you do when you do not have a community that you can bring back your psychedelic visions to? What do you do when you're not allowed to speak about your visionary experiences? What do you do when you're a teacher and you're not allowed to teach from your visionary experiences? When you are a philosopher and you're not allowed to do philosophy from your visionary experience? How can you be whole within yourself, within your heart and your mind, under these conditions? Writing Diamonds from Heaven is part of my personal path to becoming whole within myself, to being once again in the public world what I have been in the shamanic world. Writing and speaking openly about psychedelic experiences is, whether or not my colleagues understand or accept it, is a major step for me to being whole upon the earth. But I have many open questions about integration. This is where I'd like to end. How do you meaningfully integrate experiences of deep time into a time-space body? How does one meaningfully integrate experiences of archetypal reality, of oneness, of the primal void, into Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday consciousness? Remember them, yes. Write them down, paint them, sing them, yes. Absorb their insights and their truths, yes. Live by their guidance, yes. But how do you integrate the infinite into the finite? Where I am right now is that I don't think you can. The only option is to integrate the finite into the infinite. We must transform our entire existence, our body, our emotions, and our mind. We must make it transparent to the infinite. We must live our life in service of the infinite, in complete surrender to the divine presence, moment by moment. And if we do this again and again and again, one day it may be as the Indian saint Anandamaya Ma said, she wrote, "There comes a time when the beloved does not leave one anymore. Wherever one may go, he is ever by one's side, and his presence constantly felt. Trees, flowers, the water, the land, everything is the beloved, and only he." Thank you.